Hello, my name's Mariah Yori. I'm a master's student at the University of Georgia, and I'm going to be talking to you today about controlling Haemonchus contortus in goats using Sericea lespedeza. Now, this is an important topic because parasite control in livestock has become a major problem. For many, many years now, we have been taught to deworm all animals in the herd on a set schedule, whether they were wormy or not. This has caused a large amount of parasite resistance to all of our available dewormers because we have not preserved the refugia of these parasite populations. If you're not familiar with this idea, I have this picture over here that kind of explains it. Say you have the whole parasite population in a herd. These green ones are the ones that are susceptible to your anthelmintics. These red ones are the ones that are resistant. And if you treat an entire herd, none of that refugia, those susceptible parasites, are preserved. And so all the susceptible parasites, all these green ones, are going to be killed off, leaving you with only resistant parasites. And so now you've got a whole herd of animals, goats, cattle, or otherwise, that are resistant to your dewormer. Whereas if you only treat some of your herd, the ones that really need it, you're going to be left with your animals shedding both resistant parasites and susceptible parasites. And so in the future, it is going to be easier to take care of their parasite problems because there's still going to be parasites in the herd that you can kill off with your anthelmintics as needed. Now, the general rule of thumb is to deworm only the animals that need it. And this goes for all types of parasites that you will encounter in your livestock herds. But here in the southeast, Haemonchus contortus is a particularly big problem because they like our hot, humid weather. It's hard to kill them off because we don't get that freeze during the winter, and they can live in the ground for quite some time. So the effects that they're going to have on these animals are pretty concerning. You have hyperacute, acute, and chronic infections. Hyperacute are going to be the ones that, they get really wormy really quick and they die before you even realize there's a problem. The acute ones, they're going to get sick. You're going to see signs like you see over here on the left. You're going to get these anemic animals where their eyelids and their gums are going to be white. They're going to get what's called bottle jaw, this picture down at the bottom where they get a lot of edema underneath their jaw because of the parasites. Or you're going to get chronic infections where these animals are constantly shedding, constantly infecting other animals, and just not able to get rid of them because you've got all those resistant worms in your herd. And then you've got these infested pastures and barns. And now that you've got all these infected animals, your productivity is going to lower. Your animals are not going to be thrifty. And eventually, if they keep these worms for too long, they could die. And obviously, that is an economic loss and is just hard all around, emotionally, economically, for producers. Right now, we rely on multiple methods for parasite control other than just deworming on a schedule. One of the biggest ones with goats is this Heamonchus scale that you see over here on the right. It is that anemia guide for looking at the eyelids that I was talking about a second ago. 5 is white. This means your animal is very burdened with parasites, typically Haemonchus contortus, because those are the ones that are often going to cause anemia. The darker pink they are, the better off your animal is, the less worm burden it is carrying. But we also rely on fecal egg counts, pasture management, rotational grazing, selective deworming, breeding for parasite resistance and resilience. And then there's some other methods that are still in study. Copier boluses are one that has proven to have some success in helping with parasites. and then tannin-rich foods, and that is what I'm going to talk to you about today. So what is a tannin? These are phenolic plant compounds that bind to proteins and other molecules. There are actually two types. There are hydrolyzable tannins. These are typically found in fruit pods and plant galls, and they are more so absorbed in the small intestine of the animal and can actually be toxic. And then you have condensed tannins, which are in forages, in trees, and shrubs. And these are the ones that we are going to be looking at because these can be of benefit to animals. However, even with the CT, the effects vary based on the type of tannin, the concentration, and the animals that are consuming it. So some of the negative effects that we see with these condensed tannins are usually seen in high concentrations, and that is because of the mechanism through which these CT bind to proteins. So as you can see over in our picture over here, the animal eats the food, whatever it is that contains these CT, the forages, the hay, the leaves. The cell is ruptured through mastication. The extractable CT, these compounds, are floating around in the rumen. They contain a lot of hydroxyl groups on them, and so they are able, through a lot of hydrogen bonding, to bind to a lot of the proteins that are floating around in the rumen, and they kind of capture those proteins and hold on to them. And so that's why we see in high concentrations negative effects, because these CT are binding to all the proteins, so all that rumen bacteria is not able to bind to the proteins. And in these high concentrations, you'll see a lot of free CT floating around, and that plus all the bound CT is going to inhibit, through extracellular enzyme binding, these rumen bacteria. And if these rumen bacteria are not able to, have the proteins they need to survive, you're going to see less rumen motility. You're going to see less intake, you're going to see less digestibility, and decreased growth of that animal, decreased production. Just in general, the things you might expect from an animal that is not getting enough protein. However, the positive effects of these CT, when the CT is in low concentrations in the diet, are pretty amazing. You see an increase in bypass protein because that goes back to that mechanism. Those CT are binding to those proteins. They are helping to pass them through the rumen and into the small intestine. So there's a lot more protein uptake in the small intestine, a lot more amino acid uptake in the small intestine. And just in general, this animal is going to be getting more of those nutrients that way. Because of this, you're also seeing less ammonia produced, less methane produced in the rumen, so you're getting reduced gas production, which as well reduces your methane. You're going to see increased milk yield and protein composition in the milk. And you're going to see reduced parasite loads, which is what I'm going to be talking about. Now, the ones that we want to focus on that contain the correct amount of CT in them there's a couple different kinds. There's big trefoil, there's bird's foot trefoil, there's sola, which is commonly used in Europe as a forage, there's San Juan, and then there's Sericea lespedeza. So we're going to focus particularly on lespedeza because it is a very easily grown forage here in the US. It is a very opportunistic plant. It likes to grow in low fertility, acidic soils. So it does not require a lot to make it thrive. It is a legume, so it is high in those proteins, high in a lot of the minerals and other nutrients that we like our animals, particularly our dairy animals, to get. It can be grazed, it can be fed as hay or pelleted, so it is nutritional to these animals in many forms. Now, the top 4 to 10 inches of the plant are the most nutritious and tender. And if you let your animals eat it down too far, or if you cut it down too far for hay, you are left with these very woody stalks, which are not very nutritious to the animal. So you do have to really control the grazing on it or the cutting. However, the bit that you can use is very tender and very nutritious. It can be planted for erosion control and replenishment of soils because of the fact that it does like those less ideal soils. It can help to bring those back to life. However, because it is so opportunistic, it is classified as an invasive species by the Southeast Exotic Pest Plant Council and has taken over a lot of rangeland out west. That was how we first came to find out about it, because a lot of cattle were eating it, and were eating it in too high of amounts and getting those negative effects from the high amounts of CT. However, it can be controlled by not allowing it to grow to seed, because it does not spread through roots like a lot of grasses do. It spreads solely through seeds. So it can be controlled. And there's actually a domestic type of lespedeza that has been produced by Auburn University called AU Grazer. And that is the kind that you're generally going to see if people are planting it for hay or crop production. So how does this CT actually help control parasites? Well, the exact mechanism is still under debate. The common ideology is that because of how the CT works, because it binds to those proteins, it's actually creating a protein deficiency for all of the worms. And so they are not, able to grow and thrive as they normally would in the rumen. There is also the idea that the increased protein uptake of the animal supports tissue repair and immune health, which would also take care of some of the problems that worms would solve, allowing these animals to thrive on perhaps a higher worm burden and take care of those worms naturally. And even though the mechanism isn't known, there have been many studies comparing different CT plants versus non-CT containing plants to see how they affect worm loads. And these commonly show a decreased fecal egg count, decreased fecundity of those worms, which means that those worms are not laying as many eggs, which means, again, decreased fecal egg count, decreased adult larvae being grown, decreased larval development. So it is really disrupting the cycle of these parasites. One study that I looked at by Min, done in 2005, they took a bunch of Angora does. These are fiber goats. They were split into 3 groups. One grazed Sericea lespedeza, one grazed a fescue crabgrass mix, and one was rotationally grazed on both. They would spend 2 weeks on the lespedeza pasture and then 2 weeks on the grass pasture, and then went back and forth between those throughout the study. And as you can see over in our chart over here, our y-axis is our eggs per gram seen in the fecal egg count, and then the x-axis is month. This bottom line with the dots, that's the goats grazing the Sericea lespedeza. So you can see that they have the lowest worm burden. This next group, the open circles, that is the rotationally grazed group. You can see that as they go, they do gain more worms over time, but those animals are able to handle them better and not become overwormy. And then this top line here that goes way up is the grass grazed group of goats. So you can see fecal egg count and worm burden were greatly reduced in the groups on Sericea lespedeza and the rotationally grazed group, and not very great in our grass fed group. Another study I looked at that showed largely the same thing was this one done by Lang, done in 2006. This one actually used lambs, but it still showed similar results. It was 2 separate trials and involved naturally infected versus reinfected lambs with Haemonchus contortus. The control group was fed Bermuda grass only, while the study group was fed Sericea lespedeza from day 0 to day 49. And both trials showed significantly less fecal egg counts in lambs being fed Sericea lespedeza and an increase in fecal egg counts of these lambs after Sericea lespedeza was removed from the diet. So as you can see over here, we have in this top study, they did animals that were naturally infected with worms. So they did not deworm these animals in this top study. But you can see that this bottom line, the squares, is the Sericea lespedeza fed group. You can see that they handle that worm burden much better. And from day 49, as I said, they were fed Sericea lespedeza from day 0 to day 49. You can see after day 49, after they moved from that Sericea lespedeza to a grass mix, or to the Bermuda grass, you can see that their worm load starts to increase. And then the Bermuda grass only fed group, you can see that it increases pretty consistently throughout. This bottom graph, they did this study and they dewormed all the animals at the beginning of the study. And then at day 21, animals were reinfected. And you can see, again, the same thing, that the Sericea lespedeza fed group kept a much lower worm burden until taken off of the Sericea lespedeza, while the Bermuda grass fed group, again, had a much higher worm burden. So while I only showed you 2 studies, I came across many others that all showed roughly the same thing. Animals in groups fed lespedeza were consistently lower with their fecal egg counts and worm burdens than animals not fed lespedeza. So we can see that with short-term use, this lespedeza reduces hatchability and fecundity of parasites. In long-term use, it can reduce that adult parasite load in general. However, you got to remember you don't want to feed high concentrations of the CT or you will start to see those negative effects on the rumen. That being in mind, I would say that this works best as a complete parasite management plan. I don't think you want to rely completely on lespedeza. I think you still want to use a balanced diet, and if an animal still gets too wormy on this lespedeza, you will still need to use whatever anthelmintics still work in your herd. However, this gives you a good preventative for general use. Now, to keep in mind, even though one of the studies that I showed you was about lambs, and a lot of studies have been done with sheep, what I'm talking about today may or may not be as applicable to sheep and cattle as it is to goats, because interestingly enough, goats actually have a more protein-rich saliva than sheep and cattle, and it helps those CT to bind to the proteins better. So you might see more negative effects in sheep and cattle than you do in goats, and that is why it is in particular a big topic in the goat world right now, whereas it might not be so much in the others. But it is a great thing to keep in mind. It is a great option for goat owners to help with worm loads because it is such a big problem here in the Southeast. And I would encourage you all, even if you don't have goats, to look into it, and maybe you can see if it works in your herd. I hope you enjoyed this presentation. You can see my references here on this slide. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. Thank you.